On September 8, 1941, the city of Leningrad, Soviet Union's second-largest industrial and cultural center, was officially encircled by Nazi forces. All railways, roads, and waterways leading into the city were severed. Over 2 million residents, including hundreds of thousands of children, were completely cut off, trapped in the brutal northern winter of Russia. The siege would last for 872 days, becoming one of the worst humanitarian catastrophes in modern history. Amid acute shortages of food, fuel, and medicine, the people faced starvation, freezing temperatures, and constant bombardment. Daily bread rations dropped to as little as 125 grams, forcing desperate attempts at survival by any means. Leningrad came to symbolize endurance and unwavering human resilience. The siege was more than a military operation. It was the ultimate test of human physical and psychological limits. It was a place where the line between life and death, between humanity and the primal instinct to survive, became agonizingly thin. Before the war, Leningrad was the pride of the Soviet Union, its second-largest hub of industry, science, and culture after Moscow. The city was regarded as the heart of the October Revolution, the birthplace of the Soviet regime, home to more than 2.5 million people, including factory workers, engineers, intellectuals, and students. Leningrad stood as both a political symbol and the industrial engine of the Soviet Union. Soviet society at the time was deeply centralized. Everything from production and supply to military decisions was directed from Moscow. This left Leningrad, despite its scale, almost entirely dependent on the national logistics system. When war broke out, the city had no long-term food reserves, minimal defenses, and virtually no preparation for a large-scale siege. On June 22, 1941, Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in human history, deploying over 3 million troops across 3 fronts, north, center, and south. The northern offensive, led by Field Marshal Wilhelm Ritter von Lieb's Army Group North, was tasked with capturing the Baltic region and advancing on Leningrad. Hitler believed that by taking Leningrad, Germany would control the entire Baltic Sea route, sever Soviet ties with Scandinavia, and crush the industrial and symbolic heart of Soviet Russia. But instead of capturing the city, Hitler chose to encircle it and let its people starve. In Directive No. 1601, he wrote, "We have no interest in accepting surrender. The city must vanish from the face of the earth." The objective was not purely military. It was ideological, to annihilate Russian culture and spirit as part of General Plan Ost, a grand strategy for German territorial expansion through the destruction of Slavic population centers and the colonization of Eastern Europe. When the war began, the Soviet Union was still reeling from the chaos of Stalin's political purges, 1937 to 1939, during which thousands of senior Red Army officers were executed or dismissed, leaving the military severely weakened in leadership and structure. The rigid command economy made civilian evacuation and food redistribution extremely difficult. In Leningrad, local authorities received orders to hold the city at all costs, but were forbidden from evacuating civilians for fear that doing so would signal defeat. As German forces advanced, millions of civilians remained in Leningrad, and the city's food reserves could only sustain the population for a few weeks. August 1941. The German army pushed rapidly through the Baltic region, capturing Tallinn and Narva. Finnish troops, aligned with Nazi Germany, advanced southward from Karelia, forming a pincer movement that gradually closed in on the city. August 29th. German forces seized MGA, the last rail junction connecting Leningrad to the rest of the Soviet Union. Early September. Fuel depots, power plants, and port facilities came under relentless artillery fire. Road transport collapsed, and ships were unable to leave Lake Ladoga. On September 8, 1941, the siege line was sealed. From that moment, Leningrad was completely cut off. No food, no fuel, no communication. That same day, a German shell struck the Badiv warehouse complex, igniting a massive fire that destroyed tens of thousands of tons of flour and sugar, the city's only major food reserve. As black smoke billowed over the skyline, the people of Leningrad realized they had been left alone. In the first weeks of the siege, chaos engulfed the city. Hundreds of thousands rushed to hoard what little food was left. Prices on the black market skyrocketed, multiplying hundreds of times overnight. Factories shut down due to power outages. Entire residential blocks lost access to clean water. The government introduced ration cards, at first a temporary solution, but soon the only system keeping people alive. Meanwhile, the thunder of artillery from the outskirts never ceased. Each night, the skies glowed red with explosions and fire. People began to understand that this was no short-term operation, but a calculated siege, a deliberate strategy of extermination by starvation. To the Nazis, Leningrad was a symbol that had to be erased. To the Soviets, it was a symbol that had to be defended at all costs. Hitler believed that if the city fell, the Soviet Union would collapse in spirit. Stalin, on the other hand, declared, "To lose Leningrad is to lose the heart of Russia." For both sides, this was not merely a military campaign. It was a battle of willpower, a struggle for national identity. By late September 1941, Leningrad was fully encircled. All supply routes were severed. Electricity was cut. Food stores were gone. Temperatures began to plummet far below freezing. While German forces tightened the siege without, another battle began within, the fight against hunger, cold, and despair. The sound of gunfire on the front lines grew distant, but inside the city, other sounds took over. The growl of empty stomachs, the wheezing breath of the starving, the endless echo of artillery at night. From this point on, Leningrad would endure 872 days and nights of darkness, a place where war did not only kill with bullets, but with silence, drawn out to the very edge of human endurance. In the first weeks after the encirclement was sealed, artillery fire crippled Leningrad's power plants, water network, and heating systems. By late autumn 1941, the city was plunged into darkness. The winter of 1941 to 1942 proved exceptionally harsh. Temperatures often dropped to minus 30 degrees Celsius or lower, making even a few kilometers walk to food distribution points impossible for many weakened by hunger and cold. On the same day the siege began, September 8, 1941, the Badi food warehouses were set ablaze during an air raid, destroying most of the city's flour reserves. In the aftermath, starving residents dug through the scorched soil, sifting out the sugary dirt in search of crystallized traces of sweetness. The collapse of infrastructure, combined with a severe frost, pushed the city to the edge of survival during its very first winter. The rationing system quickly reached its historical minimum. From roughly 800 grams of bread per day in September, rations fell to their lowest point between November 20th and December 25th, 1941. 250 grams for manual laborers, and only 125 grams per day for civilians, dependents, and children. This was a level intended merely to sustain life, not to meet even minimal nutritional needs. The so-called blokadny chleb, siege bread, was diluted with fillers of little or no nutritional value. Bran, cellulose from seed husks, oil cake residue. Many loaves were of such poor quality that they served only as a symbolic measure of calories. When official food supplies ran out, the city's inhabitants turned to whatever could be consumed. People scraped wallpaper paste, boiled glue, softened leather belts, and shoes for gelatin. They cooked bookbinding glue and even sifted the ashes of the burned Badi warehouses to recover sugar crystals fused in the soil. Such menus are recorded frequently in diaries, memoirs, and sociological studies of the siege. Each new round of bombing and shelling not only killed directly, but also struck warehouses and supply routes, severing what remained of the city's internal distribution network. As a result, deaths came in waves. Mortality peaked in January, February 1942, with an estimated 100,000 deaths per month, mostly from starvation and exposure. Throughout 1942, hundreds of thousands more perished. The city's demographic structure changed drastically. The elderly and children died first, while those still able to stand in line were the essential workers, men and women sustaining what remained of industry. ration card became the passport to survival. Without a card, there was no food. The distribution system was stratified by priority. Essential workers, soldiers, and technical personnel received higher rations than dependents or ordinary civilians. In practice, the so-called closed shops and factory canteens serving priority laborers allowed them more regular access to food than the rest of the population. This hierarchy recreated a new social order, even amid catastrophe, and reinforced the will to keep Leningrad's war production alive. Alongside the siege came black markets and ration card fraud. Inspections and crackdowns during 1941 to 1942 uncovered hundreds of thousands of off-record ration cards, many belonging to the deceased or forged outright. Authorities declared the cancellation of around 300,000 invalid ration cards in an effort to restore fairness in distribution. This phenomenon reflected what scholars have since called a morality of scarcity. When the state could no longer guarantee basic caloric needs, citizens were forced to resort to informal exchanges to survive. But the more dire the scarcity became, the more aggressively the state responded, tightening control to maintain the last semblance of order in food allocation. As rations hit rock bottom during the winter of 1941 to 1942, theft, robbery, and bread lines, and even murder for ration cards began to surface. Both wartime records and post-war reports describe theft and hoarding as recurring features of each food distribution wave. The authorities stepped up patrols and imposed harsh penalties for stealing from the dead or using fake ration stamps. At a deeper level, this was the inevitable social consequence of a scarcity system. When a ration card equaled survival, crimes of desperation escalated along with hunger and cold. According to NKVD, Soviet security police, files and post-war summaries, more than 2,000 arrests related to acts of cannibalism were recorded in Leningrad by the end of 1942. The NKVD legally classified these into two categories: trupoyedstvo, eating the bodies of the dead; ludoyedstvo, killing someone in order to eat them. The latter typically resulted in execution, the former prison. Declassified NKVD documents made public after 2000 confirmed both the scale and timeline of these events, peaking sharply in the winter of 1941 to 1942. They also revealed a deep psychological fear that gripped the city. Rumors of corpse hunters circulated widely among the population. However, historians emphasize that these incidents, while horrifying, represented a small fraction of a much broader humanitarian disaster. They were not the norm, but rather the most extreme symptom of total societal collapse. Children were among the most tragic victims. Thousands of orphans wandered the snowy streets, their parents having collapsed in food lines or died along roadsides. By February 1942, mortality peaked at over 4,000 deaths per day, a stark number that reflected the disintegration of what had once been one of Europe's most cultured cities. The most haunting symbol of that time is the diary of Tanya Savicheva, an 11-year-old girl. In a small notebook, she recorded, one by one, the deaths of her family, her mother, siblings, grandmother, uncle, until the final entry. The Savichevs have all died. Everyone is dead. Only Tanya is left. A few days later, Tanya too passed away. Her diary was discovered after the war and is now displayed in the Museum of the Defense of Leningrad and at the Piskarevskoye Memorial Cemetery. It has become one of the most powerful human testimonies of siege, etched into global memory. The winter of 1941 to 1942 ended with over 1 million dead, but it also exposed a harsher truth. While war kills with bullets and bombs, hunger kills with silence. In the shadows of despair, Leningrad endured, not as a functioning city, but as a cruel experiment in the limits of human survival. Despite famine and sub-zero temperatures, parts of Leningrad's industry continue to function. Machine shops, communications plants, and munitions factories operated at a minimal level, supported by limited supplies transported across Lake Ladoga. According to Encyclopedia Britannica, food and fuel were brought into the city by barge during the summer and by truck convoys over the frozen lake in winter, just enough to keep the arms factories running and allow more than 2 million residents to barely survive through 1942. Maintaining production, even under starvation, extreme labor shortages, was crucial to preventing the total collapse of the city's defenses. Under siege conditions, Leningrad radio became the city's sole source of information and played a central role in maintaining social cohesion. When staff or broadcast material ran short, the station transmitted only a metronome signal, a slow beat to indicate safety, and a rapid beat to signal air raids. This sound was broadcast continuously as a psychological lifeline, a sonic proof that the city was still alive. According to the Museum of the Defenders of Leningrad, the use of the metronome was a deliberate psychological measure aimed at preventing mass panic and despair. In addition, the station aired news updates, reports from the factories, and short poetry and music programs, maintaining a thread of social continuity amid widespread psychological and informational breakdown. In 1942, music became a powerful tool of propaganda and emotional resistance. Dmitri Shostakovich's Symphony No. 7, Leningrad, composed during the blockade and completed in Kuibyshev in late 1941, performed in Leningrad on August 9, 1942, under conductor Karl Eliasberg. The Leningrad Radio Orchestra was reassembled with musicians drawn from active military units. Before the concert, Front Commander Leonid Gavrov ordered Operation Squall, an artillery barrage to silence German guns and secured performance. The symphony was broadcast live over radio and played on public loudspeakers throughout the city and along the front lines. The concert became a defining psychological and political event, demonstrating Leningrad's ability to sustain cultural life and symbolic resistance, even under siege. 1942 also marked a year of military deadlock around Leningrad. Germany prepared Operation Nordlicht, aimed at capturing the city, while the Soviet Red Army launched the Sinovino Offensive October 1942, in an attempt to break the blockade, which ultimately failed. Although the siege remained unbroken, the supply route across Lake Ladoga was kept open. In winter, trucks moved supplies over ice. In summer, barges carried cargo across the lake. Starting mid-1942, the Soviets also laid an oil pipeline beneath Lake Ladoga to provide a more stable fuel supply to the city. This fragile logistics system was the only means of sustaining basic government, healthcare, and industrial operations. From a sociological perspective, the continued functioning of production and broadcasting under siege was less about propaganda and more about maintaining public order. Factories retained regular shifts, production quotas, and discipline as a way of preserving the city's labor structure and preventing social disintegration. Radio, especially through metronome, provided a sense of continuity in public life, effectively replacing the peacetime administrative apparatus, which had been largely destroyed. The Leningrad Symphony performance embodied this broader strategy: military coordination, artillery preparation, information control, radio and loudspeakers, and cultural resistance, the concert itself, were integrated into a unified act of psychological and civic defense. It demonstrated both the organizational capacity of the city's authorities and the enduring will of its people. In essence, the continuation of life in Leningrad in 1942 was not an expression of optimism. It was a calculated survival strategy. By sustaining industrial work, preserving channels of information, and using culture as a tool of morale, both the government and the residents managed to hold together the social fabric during total siege, laying the groundwork for recovery after Operation Iskra in early 1943. Lake Ladoga was the only lifeline connecting Leningrad to the rest of the Soviet Union. Once the siege was sealed, all roads and railways into the city were cut off. In response, Soviet authorities established a makeshift transport route across Lake Ladoga, known as the Road of Life to Rogozizny. When the lake froze in winter, this route became the sole channel for bringing food, fuel, and supplies into the city, while also serving as a main route for evacuating civilians. The first convoys, initially horse-drawn sleds, later trucks, began operating between November 19th and 22nd, 1941. Transport operations took place under constant bombardment, air raids, and heavy snowstorms. Many vehicles were lost when ice cracked or drivers became disoriented in the darkness. Despite heavy losses, supply volume steadily increased. January 1942, approximately 42,000 tons. February, 67,000 tons. March, 87,000 tons, mostly food and fuel. These figures show that, although temporary, the Lake Ladoga supply line played a critical role in helping the city survive its most acute food crisis. Alongside supply efforts, the Ladoga route also became central to large-scale humanitarian evacuation. Throughout the blockade, over 1.3 million people, mostly women and children, were evacuated across the lake by boat in summer and by trucks over the ice in winter. During the first wave of evacuation, September 1941 to April 1942, approximately 659,000 people left the city. Between May and October 1942, another 403,000 were relocated. By March 1943, the total number of evacuees had reached 1.74 million, including over 414,000 children. Prioritizing the evacuation of women and children helped reduce logistical pressure inside the city, and also explains why the highest mortality rates during the winter of 1941 to 1942 were among the elderly and those unable to leave. By mid-1942, the Lake Ladoga transport system was upgraded. In addition to the truck convoys and summer barges, the Soviet Union constructed a 28-kilometer fuel pipeline beneath the lake, completed and operational by June 18, 1942. Built by divers from the Baltic Fleet, this pipeline allowed gasoline and oil to be pumped directly into Leningrad, ensuring fuel supplies for factories, hospitals, and rescue services. At the same time, maritime routes were expanded and a coordinated logistics network between the lake's eastern shore and the city was established. This allowed minimal levels of industrial production to continue and helped restore limited urban services. In early 1943, the Red Army launched Operation Iskra Spark, aimed at breaking the siege tactically. From January 12 to 18, two Soviet offensives from the southern shore of Lake Ladoga converged near Workers' Settlement No. 1, opening an 8 to 10 km wide land corridor connecting the city to Soviet rear lines. A temporary railway line over 30 kilometers long was built to the corridor in just 18 to 19 days, completed 20 days ahead of schedule. On February 6, 1943, the first freight train officially entered Leningrad. Although the new corridor remained within range of German artillery, the restored rail connection drastically improved supply capacity, ending the threat of total collapse from starvation. After Operation Iskra, the city's conditions shifted from mere survival to relative stabilization. Supplies, especially food, fuel, and medicine, began arriving more regularly by rail along the lake's shoreline. Medical services were replenished, part of urban infrastructure were repaired, and ambulances and civil services resumed operations. According to Encyclopedia Britannica, from early 1943, successful offensives tore open the siege ring and allowed a more abundant flow of supplies along Lake Ladoga. A fundamental change from the desperate dependence on ice convoys in 1941 to 1942. Still, logistical costs remain high. Even after its expansion, the Ladoga corridor remained within German artillery range throughout 1943. Soviet transport records confirm that over 1,000 trucks were lost on the ice during the first two winters, highlighting the heavy human and material toll required to keep the city alive. The road of life was not only a military asset, it became the backbone of social order during the siege. The logistics network, consisting of ice roads, pipelines, and railways, formed a continuous supply system. 1941 to 1942, providing minimal food for survival. 1942, sustaining fuel and industrial activity. Post-February 1943, enabling full-scale logistics and partial urban recovery. As a result, parts of administration, education, and healthcare began to recover. Records show that by spring 1942, only about 2,800 students were still attending school. But as the supply system stabilized, that number gradually increased. Temporary classrooms reopened in basement shelters, marking the first signs of civil life returning after more than a year of isolation. After more than 2 years of isolation, January 1944 marked a decisive turning point on the Northern Front. The Soviet Red Army launched the Leningrad-Novgorod offensive January 14 to March 1, 1944, a coordinated operation involving three army groups, Leningrad, Volkhov, and the Second Baltic Front, with the aim of pushing back Germany's Army Group North. Major assaults were launched from the Krasnoye Selo, Rapsha Axis in the southwest, and the Novgorod-Luga sector in the south, cutting off German positions along the Neva River. Following intense artillery bombardment and combined infantry, armor offensives, Leningrad was officially declared fully liberated on January 27, 1944. The 872-day siege had come to an end. The city that remained after the victory was a landscape of devastation. Of the pre-war population of 2.5 million, only about 600,000 were still alive when the siege was lifted. Modern historical sources agree that more than 1 million civilians died, mostly from starvation, cold, and disease. Direct casualties from bombings and shelling accounted for only a small fraction. In 1942 alone, an estimated 650,000 people died of hunger, a number that speaks to the unprecedented scale of urban destruction in modern history. There were no cheers when the announcement of victory came. After nearly 3 years of suffering, most survivors were too physically and emotionally depleted to celebrate. They had no strength left for joy. Silence was all that remained, the only expression of having endured. To honor the dead, the Soviet Union established Piskaryovskoye Memorial Cemetery, where more than 470,000 civilians and 50,000 soldiers lie buried in 186 mass graves. On the granite wall stands an inscription from the poet Olga Burgos: "No one is forgotten. Nothing is forgotten." That line became the defining phrase of Russia's collective memory of the siege, a vow to never allow such a tragedy to happen again. The siege of Leningrad was one of the most extreme tests of human endurance and the organizational capacity of modern society. For over 2 years, completely cut off, the city still managed to maintain industrial production, radio broadcasts, schools, and minimal public services, proving that under the harshest conditions, a community can survive if it preserves structure and shared belief. Militarily, holding Leningrad allowed the Soviet Union to maintain control of the northern corridor, safeguard supply lines to Murmansk and Arkhangelsk, and tie down dozens of German divisions, shifting the balance on the Eastern Front. But the true significance of Leningrad went far beyond military victory. It was a triumph of collective spirit over dehumanizing conditions. Where other cities in history have fallen to hunger and moral collapse, Leningrad maintained a basic sense of order. Ration cards, the ticking of the metronome on the radio, functioning arms factories, and public music performances all reflect a society that did not disintegrate, but instead continued to function in its most minimal form. People held on to rules, to discipline, and to their humanity, even when biology had reached its limit. Thus, the siege of Leningrad was not merely a tragic chapter of World War II, but a testament to civilization's capacity to resist annihilation. The Soviet Union did not just preserve a city. It preserved the very meaning of humanity in wartime. It was a victory not measured by the number of German soldiers killed, but by the fact that a community endured, kept believing, and continued to call one another human.